Okay, well, hi again, everyone. It's always a little bit chaotic here, but I'm really excited to do this panel. This is like a topic that's very close to both of our hearts and all the panelists here, and I'm sure many people in this room. So just a quick introduction. Gender, as we all know, is a very pervasive part of language. It's not just in the way that languages are constructed, but also the way we communicate to others, our identities. And as a result now, with all these language technologies that we're working on, gender does come up. And so there's a lot of work that's come up in recent years about the intersections of gender and language technologies, and now a whole slew of work that seems weirdly obsessed with the binarization of gender and detecting and mitigating bias against it. So this panel is kind of an attempt at going back against that and looking at ways that we can improve the representation of non-binary identities in language technologies, and also ways to just build technologies that are inclusive of and support non-binary people. And so I'm gonna quickly introduce myself. Sunipa's gonna quickly introduce themselves, and then we'll both shut up and let the panelists introduce themselves. So yeah, my name is Arjun. I use they, them pronouns. I just finished my first year, sorry, I guess I should say I survived my first year of my PhD at UCLA. And I am also a co-organizer with Queer in AI.
Hi, I'm Sunipa. My pronouns are she and her. I am a research scientist at Google right now, working at the intersection of computational social science and natural language processing. I am queer and AI adjacent and an organizer for widening NLP. So without further ado, we will jump in and have our stellar panelists introduce themselves in their own words. So do you?
Yeah, for the sake of keeping it less chaotic, I'm just gonna call on you. So let's have Morgan go first. Just like introduce yourself, any fun facts, interesting hobbies, briefly touch upon any work you've done at the intersections of gender and AI.
Cool. Hi, I'm Morgan Scheuerman. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a PhD candidate at University of Colorado Boulder's Information Science program. Sorry, I'm also getting over COVID, so I'm like coughing and have kind of a really stuffy voice. But generally, I research kind of how identities are embedded into technologies. A lot of my work has been focused on computer vision, specifically around how gender is codified into computer vision, as well as other identities like racial identities and how those intersect. I don't know any fun facts. I have 2 cats. Maybe they'll come on screen. That's always fun for people. But yeah, that's me.
Beautiful. Let's have Vagrant go next.
Hello, I'm Vagrant. My pronouns is these, them, and I will also accept they, them. I'm a lot of things. I'm a computational linguist. I'm a PhD student in computer science. However, I also don't really work in gender and AI. I talk about it a lot. I yell about it on the internet. In fact, it's kind of embarrassing to be here with all of these cool people who've done like good work, because the only thing you will find like on my CV of like gender work that I've actually done is like really bad. And I usually confess it to trans people whenever I meet them so that we can get it out of the way and they can decide not to be friends with me because it's a gender classifier. But I think it was also sort of useful for me to have worked on that project because that's what got me into a whole body of literature and got me sort of reconsidering the way we do all of this. And it's what makes me now feel like I would never say yes to a project like that again, just because I think the entire premise is unethical. As for fun facts, actually I have done some other gender work. I just haven't talked about it in public, but I will talk about it later on the panel. It's about neopronouns. And my fun fact is that I love birds and I'm very into birding. And this is a very important thing that everyone needs to know about me.
Beautiful. Also, this is the first time that I've heard Vagrant's voice in a really long time, and I'm so happy. Let's have Oscar next.
Hi, I'm Oskis. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Washington. My pronouns are they, them, and I work on a lot of stuff at the intersection of gender and race and disability and technology and power. including like most relevant to this is work on facial recognition and work on voice activated AI. My comment to Vagrant would just be that a surprisingly large number of career trajectories start off with being really angry about something online, and it's okay. It's okay for that to be where you're at. And my fun fact would be that I just worked this out, 3 degrees of separation from Beyonce.
Very cool. Let's have Leela go next.
I don't think I could follow up that fun fact. Nice, Oz. I can't follow that one up. So I'm Leela. I'm a PhD candidate at MIT in electrical engineering, computer science. I work on like a lot of things. Like I work on like technical stuff, but I also work on social stuff. And like on the social science side, I guess I look a lot at like data studies and like race, the intersection of like carceral technology, race science, and technology. Also like how do we look at technology from like a Black feminist lens, especially a decolonial one, and also like in a way that's not cis heteronormative. And on the technical side, I look a lot at like probabilistic stuff like heavy tails, because a lot of race science is actually based in like regressing to the mean, which means that like classifying like who tends to be the most prevalent in data sets, which ends up being like white people, which also ends up being like men, which also ends up being, it's a lot going on. And then on top of that, like there's times where you really like don't want that because you want privacy and stuff. And it's like, as trans people, as like people of color, etc., like sometimes we don't want to be classified because we're like, don't put us in the data set. But there are times where it's like, we may want to be in it if it's like a healthcare thing. So we may want to opt in it. But like in that case, it's like hard because we also don't want to give them our data. So then the like classifier ends up sucking. So then I'm like, instead of just being that person that's like, oh, let's go collect more data, like how do you make like, for instance, like, and I work a lot on healthcare data, like how do you make a healthcare like model that actually correctly classifies people instead of just being like, well, we're just going to exclude, like a lot of them exclude like Native American people and like Asian people out of the model because they're like, this isn't enough data. But anyways, I'm like, yes, it is. But that's not the point. So that's why I care about heavy tails. Sorry, that was a spiel. And yeah, and my fun fact is that I hate fun facts because I never have a fun fact. And I'm like, am I going to be boring if I say something like, oh, I like to draw, like, or something like that? I never know. But yeah.
Okay. So I wanted to give a quick shout out just before Sunipa asked the first question to Elia. So if you haven't met Elia Ovalle, they were also supposed to be panelists today, but internet connection issues became a problem. Elia is perhaps the coolest and sweetest person I know. So if you ever do meet them, you should definitely say hi, because you will probably end up becoming their best friend, and then you'll end up doing a whole lot of stuff afterwards. But yeah, I'll pass it to Sunipa.
Like it's very hard for me to not do an actual like. So I've been attending conferences virtually, and I wanted to press the like button, but I don't know how to do that in real life. So yes, I agree. If you do meet Elia, do reach out. But yeah, so welcome again. And we'll start with the questions now for our panelists. So as Arjun mentioned earlier, we know how in NLP there has been a lot of work of late trying to identify, discuss, and mitigate bias in NLP. Now, this happens across different identity axes, as it's often called in NLP. And while for race, for example, we do not binarize it as often, it is often enforced in an obsessive way almost for gender. And a large majority of papers which try to mitigate bias often assume a gender to be binary and then proceed. So our question to our panelists that we want to discuss today is, why do you think this often comes true only for gender, whereas for other identities, it's not always binarized? So let's start with Oz.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I would say that I don't think the question is necessarily about binaries in and of themselves so much as it is about convenience and familiarity and lack of complexity. And from that perspective, race is very often like treated in exactly the same way of there are these fixed essential categories that like immutably distinguish between and like cluster people together. I have a paper coming out pretty soon looking at that in facial recognition and the way that the data is really often, just as it is with gender, sort of groomed and tweaked and reframed to avoid disturbing people's idea of like what race categories there are or what race there should be. Around gender, and I think this applies with things like race and disability and sexuality as well. Part of it, I think a tiny part of it can be put down to ignorance. A lot of people think of gender as simple because for a lot of people in their own lives, gender gets to be simple. But I think a bigger part of it is about ease. It's really hard to find data sets from an infrastructural perspective or tag data sets that are trans-inclusive and include non-binary people. And it's really hard to do that in a thoughtful and nuanced way without revealing that gender is a lie and the entire premise of your experiment is nonsense. You can see this in some of the examples of people trying to add like a non-binary category to machine learning systems, which are hilarious because they just add a third category and they're like, that we fixed it, right? And of course, we all know that that doesn't in fact fix it, but you can't actually fix it without really undermining not just your certainty about this third category, but about the other two as well.
Very true. Thank you for the the insight. So same question to Leila.
Like I think I'll hit the nail on the head because I don't think that like it's only for gender. I believe it's also for race. Because a lot of times when I'm reading papers, like the data set will have like different races, but then like especially like for stuff like in the fairness space or whatever, they'll have data on different races but choose to exclude everybody else to kind of like literally make it black and white and almost like force a binary. And I definitely agree with like the essentialization and almost this oversimplification of what these categories are. Also, like I think that there's like again like this I agree with us, it's an oversimplification. There's like an erasure of intersex people. There's this like thing not understanding also that like even sex is like a constructed category socially. And so then it's like people will conflate gender and be like, we did male and female. And I think also, well, I don't want to skip ahead, so I'll just say that for right now.
No, it just comes to say like, it's very interesting that intersectionality is more often, I think, like accepted as area to study more often as opposed to fluidity, because as computer scientists, what we often want to simplify to is having discrete quantities to try and work with. But thank you for talking about this. Vagrant, would you want to add something to this?
Yeah, sure. So I had done the same thing. I had the ease being sort of central to it. And also I think I have felt like people who aren't in the space already have been trying to get into it with gender. And this is very motivated by like, oh, we're doing social good. We're like trying to, you know, fix biases. We're trying to fix problems. And this is like an easy way to get in because the methodologies are often easy. The data sets are easy because they're all binary coded. And the other thing that I think, you know, I think that one of the issues that I've seen with people who are even aware of non-binary people existing is that there's this very sort of statistical way of looking at things and saying, okay, well, you know, non-binary people and like trans people and all of these edge cases are probably like a tiny percentage. So I can still build my system and still cover like 90-something%. And so I totally should. And I have a problem with this for a lot. Well, I obviously have a problem with it for a lot of reasons, but I think there's this assumption that this systemic level of exclusion and misgendering is an acceptable harm given the social good you're getting out of the system for the other people. I reject that premise and I will talk more about that later, but I think that's a part of it as well.
Thank you. Morgan, same question. Why do you think this sort of obsessive binarization happens in the space as much as compared to other identities?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what other people have said. So I think there may be two aspects that are coming out to me here. One is kind of this ingrained power of how gender has been defined historically. And so ease comes down to like, well, what is common sense? What do we think is reality based on what we've been taught reality is? So there's like a lack of education maybe around realities beyond what is taught kind of at this like systemic level of male versus female, man versus woman. And then I guess there's a technical aspect here, which is also if your system is designed in a way that is a classifier, how can you classify something beyond that? Like kind of what As was pointing out is like immediately when you start to add a category that is not male or female, the entire premise of classifying gender breaks down. Because if you're even trying to add a third category, it's like, well, what does non-binary even look like? It can look like either category or all of the categories. And so it just inherently doesn't work. Even if you were trying to design like a fluid system, it would be on this binary, like probably designed on this binary that is how feminine does this person look versus how masculine does this person look. So I think there's a technical level of like, well, what would a machine learning system look like that didn't even include categories? I don't know if that's possible. So also kind of questioning embedding, what is the purpose of embedding social categories into technology in the first place?
Do you think there's something unique to language in this aspect? And please feel free to jump in. This is just like a question to all of you. Like what I think a lot of this is quite general for machine learning as a whole, but do you think there's something very specific and unique to language which causes this sort of categorization?
I think it depends on the language you're considering specifically. I think one of the things about English that a lot of NLP researchers use is he, him, and she, her. And a lot of the tools for English NLP are also sort of based on that. And so they do, from my research, really badly with singular they, with like tagging them and getting co-reference and correctly tagging sort of the fact that it's singular. In fact, some of them don't even have that option. Neopronouns, like you can just forget about it. It just doesn't exist, not a thing. And so yeah, I really think it depends on the language because gender surfaces in so many different ways, depending on the language that you're looking at. So we don't have like gendered adjectives in English, but there are other languages that do, for example. So it really depends.
Okay.
I guess I'm curious, maybe people might think that NLP might have more leeway than like, for example, computer vision. I don't agree that that's necessarily true, but I think the way that people view language is maybe less tied to gender in certain ways. I'm thinking less around pronouns and more around like gendered language. Like people try to classify what is the gender of this user based on how they are typing. And I think you could argue with people who have really rigid notions of gender that is not accurate, whereas people view appearance, like the general population views appearance as incredibly tied to someone's sex and gender. So I think that's a little bit different than like how people in computer vision view it.
Interestingly, I'd agree with Morgan that there's a difference, but I'd also argue that from an infrastructural perspective, I think it goes in the other direction. So this is from someone who's relatively outside NLP, so you can tell me that this is complete nonsense. But it feels like the NLP projects, NLP as a space, a lot of the time tends to be dominated by really big universalizing questions and problems and data sets. Like you've got billions of data points, not thousands. You've got, your goal isn't work out a thing for a specific domain. It's like English, we've solved it. We didn't read the amazing Stack Overflow post about using regular expressions to parse HTML, even though it applies just as perfectly to English. We're trying to solve English. That's the plan, right? And so I think that aspect of scale makes things maybe even more difficult, because on the one hand, you'd expect it to lead to more attention to the edge cases. But on the other hand, if your goal is to like solve something completely, but on the other hand, it makes those edge cases just more edge. If you have the entirety of Google Books to work off, like that's a very different kind of scale problem. And trans people and non-binary people in particular stop being like a 1% edge case and start being a 0.001% edge case.
Thank you.
Okay, so yeah, thank you everyone for your answers to the previous question. I'm going to jump in to the next question, which is a question contributed by Elia. So machine learning researchers and those in positions of power for deploying and designing AI-driven socio-technical systems need to connect more to the communities that they are impacting. How do you think we can operationalize more translational harm reduction in natural language processing? And I'm going to start off with Leela for this one.
Yeah, thank you. I have a lot of thoughts. So I'm wondering, like, I just have so many thoughts because, like, even recently, like, I'm starting to wonder what it means for like this idea about like participatory research. Because I think there's academia is really like there's a different incentive system than people might have like out in like well outside of academia. And like a lot of it seems to be performance, and like that could actually just like reify harm on like queer and trans folks and like even intersex folks, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think there's like just like a huge issue there. And then I think also like, I don't know, I think there's just so many things to consider where like, even when you include people, sometimes other people get excluded. And so I just am like weary of that, like skeptical, just for like safety issues, because like people might say that they're like, you know, queer and trans friendly, and then like they say that's their politic, but their actions are like completely different. And also some people, I don't know, and some people just aren't in community with them to do that. And I think also like, I understand that like sometimes we need to push research, like other people to do the research just because we may not be in these spaces in academia or whatever, or have access to this. But also I'm wondering, how do we put people, like empower people and give them platforms and like resources to do this kind of research themselves? That's another thing that I think about, because I think a lot of times we're like, oh, how do we like go and like do this research with these communities? But it's like, what about the communities that are already here? Like, how are you empowering them? Because a lot of times they don't, and a lot of times we don't have the resources to do what we need to do, or the time, or like all these other things. And so like, how are you anyway? But yeah, that's my spiel.
Yeah, those are some really excellent points. I also have been very wary of predatory inclusion, and this idea that these powerful people are kind of, you know, coming down to you and then asking you for your data, for your opinions, your perspectives, and they go and take it back, and then they make these models that end up like reifying very hegemonic power structures, classifications, etc., without actually benefiting you in any way. And so this stuff about distributing the research and development that goes into AI is super important. And I'm glad that I think like, you know, Timnit and some other folks are going about doing that. So I'm gonna pass the mic, the figurative mic, to Os.
I was just gonna plus one what Layla said, like I don't, yeah.
Oh, so we're gonna start, we're gonna end with the plus one? Okay, gonna pass it to Morgan.
Yeah, I also feel similar. As a person who's much more situated in HCI than I am in machine learning, I am very wary of this participatory design model or approach to things, because it's like, who is participating? Like you could, I don't think it's a good solution, because I think if you ask again, like who are you targeting? If you're asking like a general population, they probably have interests that do not necessarily align with historically marginalized groups. Or if you target one historically marginalized group, people are not homogenous and they have different perspectives. Like having talked to people about, for example, gender classification who are trans, some people do think that it might be affirming for them, and that isn't necessarily the view that other people have in that community or want. So yeah, just +1 to being like super wary and cautious about participatory design is like solving the problems, the social problems of machine learning.
Yeah, that was a really, really great perspective. And Leela and my brains are on the same frequency here, same wavelength actually. +1 on the heterogeneity thing, because I think we have this tendency to, I don't know how to make monolithic a verb, but monolithize like people's views. But there's so much intersectionality and diversity within the communities we claim to include in participation and inclusion. I'm gonna pass the mic to Vagrant.
Yeah, +1 to everything everyone's said so far. And I think rather than the sort of scientist goes down to community and like gets help and is possibly extractive or whatever, I obviously would prefer a model where we are the people making the tech. And so, there is someone in the room who is thinking about maybe not making the gender button on your sign up, well, first of all, exist if you don't need it. And second of all, make it like a radio button. There's someone in the room stopping you from doing that. But I think, more broadly, like going back to the thing that I was saying earlier, like the issue that I have and the thing that I think is happening now is people in ML and AI are sort of saying, okay, now there's like more non-binary people around and there are more of them like trying to hold me accountable. So I'm going to try to do my research better, or like I'm going to try and build a better gender classifier. I'm going to like actually have a third category instead of just having a footnote that says, okay, non-binary people exist, but sorry, I'm going to ignore you this time. But I just think that fundamentally there's a bigger issue, and the issue is that it is all right to have harm happen until you have a critical mass of people who are experiencing that harm, and then the harm is a problem and you have to sort of address it. And I think that I would prefer to live in a world where everyone matters, and even if it's just one person who's experiencing a harm, that we are actually trying to address it. And I feel like it's more sort of a community-based model of doing that, and I don't think I'm going to be very popular in academia or in industry with that sort of view. But yeah, I really think that the answers are sort of solidarity and community, and not having an individual person in whatever context have to bear the brunt of things. So I think things like the tech workers who signed the Never Again tech pledge, where basically they said they're not going to work on building databases that have identifying information about people's race and I think religion and national origin. Gender was not on that list, but if we could sort of have a collective of people that say, okay, this is important enough to us as a collective, or to people who are important to us, and we're just not going to do it, that is much better than me saying, oh, I'm not going to work at XYZ company because they build a gender detector. Like, there's only so much I can do.
Some really fantastic points. I feel like I'm just enjoying everything that everyone is saying so much. So the question, we're actually like going pretty quickly. So the question was more about harm reduction, but I kind of want to take a little tangent here and ask about if harm reduction is necessarily the right mindset or approach to take when kind of designing these systems. So this is arguable, but there is some notion of post hocness kind of embedded in harm reduction. Like we kind of build these systems and then we try to reduce harm. There's also some like apolitical things going on there where it's like we just want to make sure that people are not impacted by someone. Like if I go to my friend and I'm like, hey Dan, like you should be really glad that I'm not harming you today. Like that's kind of like a weird thing to say. So are there any ways that you think we can like practically ground some of this development of NLP systems in care work, or like just, I guess, a mindset of building systems out of a love for the communities that we're trying to impact in a positive way? And anyone can respond to this question.
not without drastic changes in the structure of NLP projects and their like organizing bodies, which is not to say it shouldn't be done, it's to say it should be done, but also like, yeah, I don't know. You start yelling about how like the problem is antitrust law and transphobia, and people start switching off unless they're antitrust nerds and or trans. But I think the thing that needs to change fundamentally is twofold. First is there's this question of scale. I think right now, even if people are like, okay, we want to do participatory stuff, we want to be accountable to communities, that's only in the context of the initial design, right? It's still a very, like, it's a much larger scale deployment. Like, relations tend to break off as soon as the developers have got what they want. And the reason for this is that there is a lack of accountability in any meaningful sense. The power relations stay exactly the same. And the reason for that, at least in part, is scale. You know, you can include people in Bushwick, but people in Bushwick cannot take on Google in its entirety and win. And so I think that one of the things that, you know, actual thoughtful, reasonable NLP work needs to do to go beyond like harm reduction ideals that leave the power in the hands of the people who were causing the harm in the first place is drastically change the scale. Like if you are developing a thing that you want to be accountable to, like the residents of Bushwick or the residents of the Central District of Seattle or the residents of Cap Hill, you need to be doing it at that scale. Like you need to be meaningfully embedded in those communities. You need not participatory research, but participatory action research, where you start off with the assumption that you are the least informed person in the entire goddamn room, and that it's the other people who should be taking the lead, and that you are there to build sustained relationships, not to tick a box on an audit process that 5 people with PhDs came up with and validated with 20 other people with PhDs.
And I suppose like on the note of scale and thinking about like how do you do this locally for smaller communities, like there's been like some great ideas coming out of like, for instance, Data for Black Lives, who had this thing like this like this ongoing politic called like Abolish Big Data, where they are actually thinking about like issues with scale and like how that causes problems, because like, and also like some people have written about this, how like when you make just an extremely large data set, it's just really hard to like comb through the whole thing if you're just scraping the whole internet, like you don't know what's in there. And so now like the internet is such like a cesspool, it's like the bowels of like the digital world. And so there's just so much stuff on there that's so harmful. And so all of those things just get put into the model. And then also there's like foundation models where like they like we're just training like those. And like on that note, it's just really hard to train like an ML model, deep learning model in general. Like people don't talk about that, but it's actually pretty hard to train one like and get like really high accuracy like on your like on its own. It's like you usually do have to use like a pre-trained model that was pre-trained on like an ungodly amount of data. And so these foundation models are like also like a thing. And I guess like Timney also did have a paper about that that's like extremely informative, like stochastic paradox, where like her and Emily Bender and stuff also talk about issues, and Margaret Mitchell and somebody else also talk about the issues with like just like scraping a bunch of data and then not looking at it and then like wondering why your model is just saying like very harmful stuff. But there are like some community organizations who have models like this. And yeah, and there have been, anyways, yeah, so I'll stop talking now.
I just want to quickly plug a Rachel Tatman talk called What I Won't Build, because I think what we're talking about here now and what people do talk about is, oh, how can I reduce the harms of my system that I'm definitely going to build? And I don't think enough people are asking the question, should I build it in the first place? And I think a lot of things just need to not be built. So watch that talk.
Okay, thank you so much, everyone, for your thoughts, especially at the end there on scale and the kinds of systems we should and definitely should not be building. I'm going to transition to the next question, which is actually Sunipa's question, but Sunipa had to leave because she's moderating another panel. So the question is, as new large language models rapidly emerge, there's a growing need to understand the impact they have in terms of the lived experiences and their impacts on people who are subject to their deployment. While researchers and practitioners have focused on some harms, are there some harms with respect to gender that you think haven't been considered by the community? And so the community is very vague here, but I guess the people designing or developing these systems and haven't been focused on as much as is needed. And I'll start off with Vagrant here.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about my neopronouns work because I think neopronouns are a thing that are not, that, you know, aren't considered very much. And this has varying relevance, but obviously, like in English, I at least am very familiar with lots of communities that use neopronouns, and in German as well, although it seems to not be as big, at least sort of from my limited experience in Germany. So yeah, I think the issue is twofold. One is I don't think people are considering neopronouns at all. So all of the tools that we have for everything just fall flat on their faces when you give them neopronouns. And the other thing is, with large language models specifically, the way that they are is such that when you have something that is in the long tail, you just won't get it as output. So if you think about like generation with large language models, you're never going to get a generated neopronoun, even if it was in the training data, which again, that is also probably not happened. So I did a thing earlier this year. This was my research that I did as part of a lab that I haven't talked about because I'm very shy. And basically, I built a story generation system that would create stories with characters that use neopronouns. So this is the first time that I've been able to see like a generated story that has a character that uses my pronouns. And I think this sort of, there's one factor, which is, okay, yeah, we don't care about neopronouns. And then there's this other thing, which is, I think all of us focus a lot on like the bad stuff that's out there, the bad ways in which people are operationalizing gender and doing gender. And I find that sort of work is just personally very exhausting, and it's like my entire life, right? So why would I also want to do it for work? I have a lot of respect for all three of you. So yeah, I think I would prefer to do more sort of hopeful building, and I feel like that is not a thing that maybe is happening as much. So yeah, hopeful building that helps people see themselves in these tools.
Amazing. That's really exciting work. And I'm really glad about any opportunities really to like integrate queer joy into natural language processing. So I'm going to pass the mic to Morgan.
I mean, I would say yes, generally. Like my answer to are there harms that no one's focusing on has to be yes, because there's probably things that happen that are harmful to people that I do not know are harmful to people, right? Because it's like whatever our experience is what kind of shapes how we view what harm is. So I'm sure that there are a lot of things that are being under-examined or under-talked about just because we're not aware that, you know, these set of people have been harmed by this thing. I guess it's another potential like thing that hasn't been discussed as much as like, what is the tension between harm and joy? So like what I was saying earlier is like some people do think that certain things can be built in a way that would be super beneficial to certain communities, but that could also be harmful to other people in that community. And so I think exploring more about when do these tensions come up? How can you deal with them? Maybe it is around issues of scale and like how deploying things in very specific contexts. But I think there is a lot, it's more like, okay, is it a harm or is it a benefit? And not like this gray space of, well, things can have harms and benefits, but how do we address that? So less of a harm that we're ignoring and more of just like a general like ethical, moral problem. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really excellent point about this kind of tension. I think we have a tendency to be like, this is definitely harmful or this is definitely not harmful. And that characterization in and of itself can be harmful when we don't consider kind of different people's perspectives and the impacts of these technologies in their lives, as well as dual use and a whole lot of other things going on there. I'm gonna now ask us about their thoughts.
Yeah, I really liked Vagrant's point about the idea of integrating queer joy. And yeah, there's this term I've been noodling on, which I ran into in a philosophy of education paper, which is critical hope, which is it's not enough to just say everything's shit and then run out. That tends, you can't build a world on, well, we know what we're not doing. And so there is, I think, an important area to be filled and expanded on, like, what can we do as well as what shouldn't we do? And I think like some of Morgan's work has been like looking into that for kind of a while. Like Morgan is way ahead of the curve on this. In terms of like, you know, problems we haven't spotted yet, I want to get, I guess, a kind of meta and say that the two I'd point to are first, like what we might call like aggregate harms, by which I mean both like the harms that accrue to a person not as a result of one system taking a particular approach, but like 30 or 40 systems taking an approach. And I think that that's something that's really hard to track in the methodologies that a lot of NLP spaces and a lot of HCI spaces are comfortable with. It's like, it's difficult to track that kind of death by 1,000 cuts thing in a way that feels like it's methodologically robust. And I think that gets in the way of having conversations about it. And second, like linked to that is not just the people who are harmed, but also the harm that is done, by which I mean like, when you have these systems, you're not just directly harming trans people, you're also communicating to people who don't have to think about gender that they still don't have to think about gender. And I think we need to talk about what our moral responsibility is there to continue sort of like concretizing this idea of gender, not just for the people it directly harms, but for the ways that it calcifies fixed ideas of gender in the eyes of people who have a lot of power as voters, as speakers, as academics, et cetera, not just to inform like the design of technology, but also to inform, you know, the shape of healthcare or political manifestos, or like this is a lot bigger. And it gets into my last thing, which is the really meta thing, which is this question of when the harms we do interfere with people's ability to point out the harms we do. Like, we can only spot harms that people notice. And this gets difficult because technology can really shape people's access to personhood. If you have technology, if you're for example, if you have a like extremely rigid norm of like race and gender and disability that's deeply alienating to anyone who falls outside that norm, and it's integrated with your like feedback system, then you have a circular problem, which is you're diminishing the capacity of people to point out that your shit is fucked. And I think that's something that we really need to attend to, is these ideas of personhood, and how the fact that personhood is a questioned like status really like just drives a fucking like 18-wheeler right through these ideas of fairness and accountability and transparency. You can't be accountable to people you don't see as people. You can't be fair to people whose like group identity isn't treated as legitimate. You can't be transparent if you consider the people's request for transparency to be unintelligible. And this is, again, a really meta point, but I think it's worth like highlighting the fact that a lot of the bigger problems are like structural and political and social, not technological. But at the same time, like technology informs politics as well as being informed by it.
Thank you for those fantastic and very eloquently stated points. I think one thing that I really liked that you said, and it's actually captured very nicely in a recent paper by Upolis on, is this idea of like algorithmic imprint and how the harms remain and linger even beyond the termination of the deployment of some algorithm. So like this idea that we can have these systems that are affecting people, and then we have this notion that we can like kill it, and then like all the harms are gone. But of course, outputs of these models, these systems are viewed as some kind of scientific truth or knowledge, and even like long beyond the usage of things like AI in assessment of A-level exams. Like the paper found that like Bangladeshi students still had that mindset of like who was in power. Like it reinforced a lot of colonial ideas in that process. I'm gonna pass the mic now to Leela to finish off for this question.
Okay, well, I think obviously like that's why we're here and why y'all wanted to do this panel is because there's like a dearth of this type of literature coming out, and like talking about like gender essentialism in NLP. And like I think also like OS has undersold themselves, and like they also have a paper about like voice recognition and like talk to trans people and stuff. And I feel like that's also like relevant to the conversation, and like the conversation of like transness and non-binary identity or whatever you want to call it in NLP. And then also I think like I did want to get this point off about gender devising papers, because a lot of them like actually just say like, what if we made all these words neutral, but they approach it in like a very technical way. And also they don't think about like for people who may not want that, because for some trans people it might actually be affirming to have like certain words that are feminine or masculine. So there's like almost like this attempt to like oversimplify the problem, and also depoliticize it, because like also why are those words on like a certain axis of like quote unquote feminine or masculine. And also like why, like I feel like there's also a hyper focus, like a where there needs to be some more focus is like a focus on social issues, because there's a hyper focus on like technical issues. Like for instance, like to Vagrant's point about like, oh, like non-binary people and trans people are like, and queer people are in like the long tails. Like what would eventually come of that, somebody would be like, oh, we could just do data augmentation, and then even sometimes that isn't necessarily like the answer to the problem. And so and also I just want that paper from Oz about the critical hope, because it's so necessary in like these times. But yeah.
Okay, so if I could get a round of applause for all of the panelists. Did an absolutely amazing job, and it's even more amazing because we have 10 more minutes, and that means that all of you wonderful people can ask any questions that you have. So I'm going to alternate between the chat and the people here in person. Yes, I'm going to start with the people here in person because y'all have your hands up already.
Yeah, so can folks on Zoom hear me? Do I need to talk louder?
I can also repeat your question if that's easier. You can actually go up there, that's a good point.
Hi, so Vagrant, you made a really good point about more people needing to ask, should we, before we start asking, can we? And I'm curious to the panelists, what do you think how do you think we can get more people to ask, should we, with respect to language and AI technologies?
That's a really good question. Yeah, I should also state that if you think I'm smart for saying that, it's literally only because I went to the Rachel Tapman talk and you should listen to her. But I think that we're doing some things, I guess. I mean, part of it is people like Rachel saying that and like doing a keynote talk at WNLP about it and getting people to hopefully listen. And I think also we're doing that, we're sort of doing it at some conference venues by asking for people to do like an ethics statement and having ethics review now. That's like a new thing. I did some ethics review last year for a couple conferences. And yeah, I mean, I really think that actually giving people a formula, like a set of questions is a start to be like, okay, have you even considered these things? Have you thought about the data that you're using? Have you thought about the other systems that you're interfacing with? Have you thought about the people, etc.? It's not great. Like really what I want to do is I want to finish this PhD in computer science so I can yell at all the computer scientists and say, I have a fucking PhD in computer science and I'm telling you that you need to read more linguistics and like queer theory and like feminist literature. So yeah, really, I mean, I think we're doing some things. I think that ethics review definitely helps with it, but it's all just a process, right? Like I feel like I'm learning things every day. I think every one of us is hopefully learning things every day. So I don't think we can just hope for something perfect to happen overnight. But I think if everyone is open to things being a process and to learning more and doing better, then I think we can hopefully get somewhere.
Anyone else is welcome to chime in as well. So I'm like realizing just now that I should have been standing here the whole time because I haven't been looking at any of your faces this entire panel. It's been a very weird experience. I'm just like staring here and I'm hearing voices come out of the side of me. Yeah, so there's no questions in the chat, so I'm happy to take your question if you want to come up here. Yes, people are coming up.
Hello. So I guess my question was, so at the start, you were saying that the problem is like simplicity. So, and then later on you were speaking about like scale. So I guess my question is like, do you think so these to me seem like sort of the fundamental values of comp sci. One is like abstraction and the other is like scale. So do you think that sort of fundamentally the problem is with doing this work in the space of like comp sci values? And yeah, like how do you, and like we're all trained in those values. So how do you deal with the conflict of this kind of fundamental training and having to do this work?
So that's really interesting because I would say that those are actually anathema to comp sci values. So I think that one of the important things to do here, and maybe I say this because I'm a historicist, is to historicize things, right? Like the shift to calling it computer science in the like 50s and 60s was designed specifically to bring it in line with mathematics, right? To merge mathematics and electrical engineering, which were the sort of two academic domains at that point concerned with computing, and make them like play nice together. And from that perspective, the values of computer science were very different from scale alone. Like the value was precision and like universalism in the sense of like it should be mathematically proved and provable. That doesn't allow for an edge case. In fact, that abhors edge cases. And I think that it says that if you come back with an answer that is only an answer like 60% of the time, then go back and like come up with a new proof. And if you can never come up with one, then that's what we call an unsolved problem and you shouldn't implement it. I think what changed, honestly, is the values we associate changed. That what we're talking about is not inherently computer science, but instead software engineering. It is it as an implied and industrial field that has been heavily like informed by the needs of industry, the needs of large for-profit organizations, the need to move fast and break things, which is great if you're Facebook, but terrible if you're one of those things. And I say this not to just be contrary and pedantic, but instead to say that there was that shift, that we shifted from like people wandering around thinking about entropy in abstractable, like formally provable ways to fuck it, it works on my version of JavaScript, ship it. Communicates also that those values can shift back or shift in a new direction altogether, that they're not set in stone, that this isn't fundamental to computer science. This is the circumstance in which computer science is deployed. And that if we change that circumstance and those values, like that is doable. We don't have to throw it away. We just have to add in a couple of new bits and then reconfigure them. Basically, that we can patch it the same way that we do the output. And the patches might be extensive, and at the end, there might be very little of the original left, ship of Theseus style, but like that's how code works.
I think this is super interesting because I also find it interesting you're highlighting like the history of computer science in the sense of like applied science was always viewed as not real science, which is really funny because now you have to argue, at least I've had this experience of like, you have to argue with the computer scientist that thinks that they are more of a scientist than the social scientist. which historically it has not been viewed as more of a science than social science. So it's really funny to me. But I think also, yeah, this tie with industry is really interesting. And I think something this is not an answer, but something to ponder, something that's interesting to me is that, and I was thinking about this when Vagrant was talking too, like, well, part of the issue is the education of computer scientists. And then I've noticed that it's actually worse when computer scientists go into academia rather than industry, even though industry is driving the need to be like, you know, applicable and universal. Industry is also dealing much more with real human beings. And so when they get a lot of like pushback and kickback, they've responded more forwardly, I think, than like the academic community. And I think this is, you know, a generalization. And I also will say I'm less familiar with NLP, and people I've talked to who are familiar with NLP say it is much better of a community than computer vision is. But it's interesting to me to see that, you know, industry has pushed computer scientists to shift values towards, you know, universal and scalable and deployable. And at the same time, now industry is trying to shift values around ethics in a way that benefits them, obviously, for the market, but the discipline itself is not responding. And so I guess it all feels very like over our heads as individuals. Like this is like, oh, we need some kind of like paradigm shift to happen within computer science, and maybe that's happening now. Yeah, that's just me ranting. Like all of this is super interesting. I don't have an answer for it.
Okay, amazing. So there were a couple of other questions in the chat, but we are at time, unfortunately. So I'm gonna put these people on the spot, and if they're okay with receiving emails, since everyone loves emails so much, you know, you can definitely send your questions their way. And yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for attending, for being panelists. I guess speaking is the word there. I'm not going to thank myself for moderating, but this was a really great, event. And I really appreciate it. All your Os responds so quickly to emails. Os is also very nice in emails, so it's like they'll respond and then add a compliment at the very end, and it's like the only thing that gets me through my day sometimes. But yeah, well, thank you, everyone. Bye, panelists.
Thank you so much for having me. This was fun.
All right, I'm gonna thank the moderators because they were great. So round of applause for the moderators. And also there is some pizza outside that was ordered by the DNI committee. So you're more than welcome to help yourself with some pizza. And we'll see everyone back at 2:30 p.m.